I'm talking to Kate Hudson from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Now, CND said from the off that the military intervention in Libya was a mistake and that it could in fact result in a major civil war in Libya. Kate, thanks for talking to us. Now, do you see your predictions coming true?
Well, unfortunately, what we were fearing does seem now to be taking place, that it hasn't been some kind of quick humanitarian swoop that would be over very rapidly and peace and justice would be miraculously introduced. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened, and we see now from the initial number of countries involved, now we have NATO involvement, we seem to be more entrenched there. There doesn't seem to be any visible end in sight. It's now widely recognised that it is indeed a civil war, and that of course intervention in a civil war is illegal. But I think one of the most tragic elements of course is the repeated, unfortunately now repeated incidents of the interventionist forces actually killing the side that they ostensibly are there to support, which just really underlines the complexity of the situation, the difficulty of the situation and the absolute inappropriateness of military intervention.
What would you like to see happen now, though? Surely you wouldn't want to see NATO pulling out and leaving the Libyans essentially to a bloody civil war.
Well, unfortunately, I think that that would indeed be the most appropriate thing to do. It's a complex situation. It's clear that rather than what was initially suggested, which was one mad dictator going around killing his people en masse, it is now clear that there are two political and military sides, and that in a complex situation like that, it may be very difficult to move towards a negotiated settlement, a political settlement, but that is what has to be done. Military means are not a quick fix, and there is no substitute for that detailed kind of negotiation facilitated by the international community, yes, but that has to take place. It's going to be hard, but it will have to take place.
What do we know about the weaponry being used in Libya? I'm thinking specifically of depleted uranium. We've heard Prime Minister David Cameron saying that it's definitely not being used, and yet the Ministry of Defence still says that it's a necessary part of the arsenal.
Yes, that's quite an interesting contradiction that has emerged there. It's led some people to suspect that David Cameron didn't really understand what depleted uranium was, and that perhaps he was actually talking about cluster munitions. But there are very serious concerns that depleted uranium munitions are now being used in Libya. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of the uranium enrichment process for civil nuclear power. It results in a very, very heavy metal, very dense heavy metal, and it's typically used in armour-piercing shells. That's why it is popular with some armies. And both the US and the UK do still have a policy of using depleted uranium munitions. The weaponry which Britain is currently deploying is not suitable for British DU munitions. They are land-based munitions in our case, but certainly the United States typically uses depleted uranium munitions on A-10 aeroplanes. Those are the kind of gunships which are essentially a plane constructed around a cannon, and they can fire thousands of rounds of depleted uranium munitions. The top brass, US top brass, that announced that those air gunships were being used, then did subsequently say DU munitions weren't being used on them yet, so to speak. But we have no confidence in that statement, because in the past conflicts where DU has been used, notably in the first Gulf War, in Bosnia, in Yugoslavia in 1999, and subsequently very extensively in Iraq, on all those occasions they denied the usage of them, and it only became evident afterwards that they had indeed been used. So we do not have confidence in the current assurance that the A-10s deployed in Libya aren't using depleted uranium, and we know the terrible consequences for the health, for the environment as a result of depleted uranium usage. It's a radioactive weaponry form. There is great incidence, sharp increases of birth defects, of cancers, particularly brain cancers, lymphomas and so on, in Iraq and those other places as a result.
We've heard time and time again that these airstrikes are designed to protect civilians, but even the potential use of depleted uranium gives the lie to that, surely.
Well, absolutely, because depleted uranium is a weapon of indiscriminate effect. Because of the impact, what happens is that when the shell or the round hits its target, it explodes, and it has what's been described as a kind of aerosol effect of radioactive particles. And you can't ever ensure that those particles will only affect military personnel. That means that they can indiscriminately affect civilians, and that, of course, is illegal under international law. Also can have a very long-term effect because of the radioactive qualities, has a negative impact also on the environment. So these are illegal under international law. Some countries haven't yet recognised that, and as indeed you've seen on the MOD website, the British government justifies the continued use. But it's absolutely unacceptable. If you're talking, well, it's unacceptable in any case, but particularly if you're talking about being there to protect the civilians, to use a form of weaponry which will impact on them in so devastating a way is absolutely shocking.
This started off in Libya as a people's revolution. How do you think that the involvement of NATO in that corrupts the idea of this revolutionary fervour amongst the people?
Well, I think it delegitimises the idea of popular sovereignty. That's been very much the case in all these uprisings recently. It's been very much about ordinary people coming to the fore, finding their political voice and saying that they want things to be run differently, and they want the people to determine, through the ballot box or whatever democratic form they choose. And of course, if you have foreign powers intervening on one side or the other in that conflict, I think it really withdraws that kind of popular sovereignty element, particularly when you consider that the key countries involved in the intervention, that's to say initially, of course, Britain and France, both have a long history and tradition of colonial intervention in that region, and of course the United States since the Second World War also has a history of military and political intervention in North Africa and the Middle East. So it's a bit like a throwback, almost a throwback to previous methods from those countries, ways of establishing or re-establishing their involvement and control. And that is not a good start for what are essentially liberating movements in those countries, towards democracy, away from authoritarian government.
And what do you make of these shifting intentions by the coalition on Libya? Do you think that the UN Security Council resolution has been abused?
Absolutely. They've gone far, far beyond the terms of the UN Security Council resolution. And one's seen them juggling with words, trying to make what they're doing fit with the terms of the resolution. But of course, it's transparently not possible to do that. And of course, as in the case of intervention in the civil war, that is illegal under international law. And a UN resolution to that effect wouldn't make it legal. But in fact, that resolution doesn't cater for intervention in a civil war.
We've now seen the rebels saying that they're disappointed in the amount of help that NATO has offered them. What do you make of that?
Well, I imagine that they probably don't have experience of dealing with NATO or dealing with foreign governments and their intentions and intervention and so on. I'm sure that they were hoping that military intervention would mean that they would very rapidly meet their military goals, which of course is to come to power in the country and establish democracy, and whatever their goals are. I'm sure they must have felt that it was a much simpler matter, and will be very disappointed to know that not only have their own side being killed by the interventionist forces, but that this is a long, increasingly protracted struggle with no easy end in sight. And I feel for them in their disappointment, but I'm sorry to say that there is no short, quick way of solving this without those very detailed political negotiations that will have to take place ultimately.
Thanks to a recent government report, we now know that the UK was selling weapons to Gaddafi's regime as little as 4 months before this trouble started. The report says that that was a misjudgment of the risk that those weapons would be used on civilians. Do you accept that as a misjudgment?
Well, I think that's rather hard to say. I don't quite know what their intentions were in doing that. I don't know if when they sell arms to regimes they have a kind of human rights, political democracy and freedom benchmark against which they measure their sales. I'm sure they can't have that, because if they did, they wouldn't sell arms to a very large number of countries that they currently do. And I'm sure that commercial interests have always come first in those kinds of deals, and I very much hope that there will be a real reassessment of that now.
Recently, you and 400,000 others marched in London against the government. How much support did you perceive for your Hands Off the Middle East position at that march? Do you think that public outcry against this intervention is growing stronger? Yes,
obviously most people were there, or everyone was there, really protesting about the government cuts, but it's not wasted on people, it's not lost on people, the fact that so much money is being spent on wars. And one of the points we were making was that if there's not money for education, for higher education, for libraries, for nurseries, all these types of things, if people are being made unemployed, saying there's no money, why is money always found for war? Why is it found for nuclear weapons? Not only Iraq, then Afghanistan, but also now Libya. How can this be justified? And I think the opinion polls very strongly show that the majority of people agree with us on that. There's a fairly small minority now supporting the government in its aims or in its intervention in Libya, and the majority are not in support of that. And that doesn't surprise me at all, because I think particularly since what happened in Iraq and sort of government shenanigans over that and sort of dishonesty about our war aims, I think people are now much more critical and much more wanting to make their own assessment of these things. And of course, with the development of the internet, a lot of information is there for people to arrive at their own judgment, and on balance the British people in their majority arrive at a judgment for peace.
Kate Hudson, thank you very much.
Thank you.